Amid lights, toasts, and fake smiles, a desperate plea cuts through the celebration. "Please, Mom, give me back my crutch," begs the girl lying on the wet grass. The father, upon hearing this, realizes he returned home at the exact right moment. But what he discovers that night is only the beginning of a calculated conspiracy. Chapter 1. The black sedan pulled through the iron gates 3 hours earlier than expected. Richard Montgomery loosened his tie as the vehicle rounded the curved driveway, his mind still tangled in numbers from the Tokyo conference that had ended abruptly. Through the window, he could see the glow of lights cascading across the manicured lawn, the silhouettes of guests mingling on the terrace, champagne glasses catching the last rays of the setting sun. Victoria had mentioned something about hosting a charity gala this weekend, but he had assumed it would be a small affair. Not this elaborate display of wealth and influence. The car rolled to a stop near the side entrance. Richard gathered his briefcase and stepped out, nodding to James, his driver, who had served the family for nearly a decade. The older man's expression seemed strained, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something Richard could not quite identify. Concern, perhaps, or worry. Walking toward the house, Richard could hear the murmur of conversation, the delicate notes of a string quartet drifting through the warm Connecticut evening. He paused at the corner of the mansion, adjusting his cufflinks, preparing to enter through the back to avoid disrupting Victoria's carefully orchestrated event. She thrived on these gatherings, on being the perfect hostess, the woman who could charm investors and socialites alike with her practiced smile and impeccable taste. Then he heard it, a sound that sliced through the ambient noise like a knife through silk. A child crying. His child, Emma. Richard moved quickly around the side of the house, past the rose garden that Victoria had redesigned last spring, following the sound to the expansive lawn that stretched behind the terrace. The scene that unfolded before him seemed to exist in a different dimension, a pocket of cruelty hidden just beyond the reach of the party lights. Emma was on the ground, her small body crumpled on the wet grass, her hands reaching desperately towards something just out of her grasp, her crutch, the specialized walking aid that helped her navigate the world after the accident that had taken so much from her 3 years ago. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the moisture from the evening dew, and her voice cracked as she called out, pleading for help. Standing several yards away, Victoria turned slowly, her emerald gown shimmering in the fading light. Her expression was cold, distant, as if the child before her was merely an inconvenience, a blemish on an otherwise perfect evening. She said something Richard could not quite hear, her lips moving in what appeared to be a sharp rebuke, before turning on her heel and beginning to walk back toward the terrace, where the guests remained blissfully unaware. Something inside Richard broke, not shattered but cracked open, releasing a flood of emotions he had kept carefully contained for too long. The endless business trips, the late nights at the office, the way he had buried himself in work after losing Catherine, Emma's mother, convincing himself that providing for his daughter meant building an empire rather than simply being present. All of it crystallized in this single moment, this image of his 8-year-old child alone and abandoned on the cold ground. He dropped his briefcase and ran. His expensive shoes sank into the soft earth as he crossed the lawn, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Behind him he could hear the music stop, the conversations fade. Someone had noticed. Several someones. But Richard did not care about the audience, about the eyes that were surely turning toward this unfolding drama. He cared only about reaching Emma. When he knelt beside her, she looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of surprise and relief. She had not expected him home tonight. She had not expected anyone to come for her. Her small fingers were still outstretched toward the crutch that lay 10 feet away, tossed into the shadows like a piece of unwanted debris. Richard gathered her into his arms, feeling the tremors that ran through her thin frame, the way she curled against him as if trying to disappear. He retrieved the crutch with one hand while holding her with the other, then stood, cradling his daughter against his chest. She weighed so little, this fragile being who carried the memory of her mother in every feature, in the curve of her nose, in the color of her eyes. Victoria had stopped walking. She stood at the edge of the terrace now, one hand gripping the stone balustrade, her face carefully composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of something that might have been fear. Around her, the guests had fallen silent, their champagne glasses frozen mid-air, their conversations abandoned as they watched the scene unfold. Richard walked toward his wife, each step measured, controlled. Emma buried her face in his shoulder, her quiet sobs muffled against his jacket. When he reached the terrace stairs, he paused, looking up at Victoria, at the woman he had married 2 years after Catherine's passing, believing she could help fill the void, believing she cared for Emma as her own. He had been catastrophically wrong. Victoria descended the stairs, her movements graceful, despite the tension that radiated from her body. She reached out as if to touch Emma, her voice taking on a honeyed tone that Richard now recognized as performance. She began to speak, words tumbling out about misunderstandings, about Emma being difficult, about how she had only been trying to teach the child independence. Richard cut her off. His voice was low, steady, but carried a weight that made several nearby guests take a step back. He told her to stop, to not say another word, to not touch his daughter. The pretense, the facade of the happy blended family, crumbled in that instant, revealed as the fragile illusion it had always been. Martha, the housekeeper who had been with the Montgomery family since before Emma was born, appeared at the edge of the crowd. Her weathered face was drawn with concern, her hands clasped tightly together. When Richard's eyes met hers, she gave a small nod, a gesture that confirmed what he was beginning to understand. This was not an isolated incident. This had been happening for some time, hidden behind closed doors, concealed beneath Victoria's carefully maintained image. Richard shifted Emma's weight in his arms and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. He told Victoria to pack her things, to leave this house tonight, that their arrangement, their relationship, whatever it had been, was finished. The guests gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the assembled crowd. Victoria's face went pale beneath her makeup, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words that would not come. She tried to argue, to plead, to appeal to the audience of powerful people who had gathered to celebrate her hospitality. She painted herself as the victim, the stepmother who had tried so hard only to be rejected by a troubled child, a grieving man who could not see reason. Her voice rose, becoming shrill, desperate. But Martha stepped forward, the elderly housekeeper who had witnessed countless private moments, who had cleaned Emma's tears and tended her injuries, spoke with quiet authority. She confirmed what Richard had seen, described incidents he had missed during his endless absences, painted a picture of systematic cruelty disguised as discipline. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others whispering behind their hands. James, the driver, had moved closer as well, positioning himself near the driveway, as if to ensure Victoria would indeed depart as ordered. His presence was a silent testimony, another witness to truths that could no longer be hidden. Richard turned away from his wife, from the woman who had revealed herself to be a stranger and carried Emma into the house. Behind him he could hear Victoria's protests, the murmur of the departing guests, the collapse of the evening she had so carefully orchestrated. But none of it mattered. Only Emma mattered, only making sure she was safe, warm, clean. Inside, he climbed the wide staircase to the second floor, to Emma's room with its pale yellow walls and shelves lined with books she loved. He set her gently on the bed and retrieved a warm washcloth from her bathroom, carefully cleaning the grass stains from her hands and face, wiping away the tears that had begun to dry on her cheeks. She watched him silently, her eyes wide and uncertain, as if she could not quite believe he was really there. Richard wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize for all the times he had not been present, all the moments he had missed. But the words caught in his throat, inadequate for the magnitude of his failure. Instead, he simply held her hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath her skin, the slight tremor that still ran through her fingers. Martha appeared in the doorway with a tray of warm milk and cookies, comfort food that Emma had loved as a small child. The housekeeper set the tray on the bedside table and exchanged a meaningful glance with Richard. They would need to talk, she seemed to say. There was much to discuss, much he needed to know. But first he needed to be here, fully present for his daughter. He needed to begin the long process of rebuilding the trust he had allowed to erode, the connection he had let fray. He pulled a chair close to Emma's bed and sat down, making it clear he was not going anywhere, not tonight, not ever again if he could help it. Emma reached for a cookie with shaking hands, took a small bite, and then looked at her father with an expression that broke his heart. It was hope, fragile and tentative, mixed with fear that this moment might be temporary, that tomorrow things might return to the way they had been. That he might leave. Again. Richard made a silent promise to himself and to his daughter. Things would be different. He would be different. The empire could wait. The business deals could be delegated. Emma needed a father, not an empire builder. She needed protection, presence, love. Downstairs he could hear movement, voices, the sounds of Victoria gathering her belongings. Good, he thought. Let her leave. Let this chapter close so a new one could begin. He had been blind for too long, choosing to see only what was convenient, what allowed him to maintain his carefully controlled existence. But he could see clearly now, and what he saw demanded action, demanded change. As Emma finished her milk and curled up beneath her blankets, Richard remained in the chair, watching over her as she drifted towards sleep, her small hand still clutching the edge of his sleeve, as if anchoring herself to his presence. This was where he belonged. This was what mattered. Everything else was just noise. Chapter 2. Morning light filtered through Emma's curtains, casting soft shadows across the room where Richard had spent the entire night, dozing fitfully in the chair beside her bed. His back ached, his suit was wrinkled beyond repair, and his phone had buzzed incessantly with messages he had ignored. For the first time in 3 years, the business could wait. His daughter stirred beneath the covers, her eyes opening slowly, and when she saw him still there, a small smile crossed her face before uncertainty clouded it again. Martha knocked softly before entering with a breakfast tray. The smell of fresh pancakes and maple syrup filled the room, and Richard noticed how Emma's expression brightened at the familiar comfort food. The housekeeper had been making these same pancakes since Emma was a toddler, back when Catherine was still with them, back when breakfast had been a family ritual rather than a rushed obligation before school. As Emma ate slowly, carefully, Richard finally picked up his phone. 47 messages, 12 missed calls. Most were from his office, but 3 were from a number he did not immediately recognize. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway, pressing the callback button. The voice that answered was crisp, professional. It belonged to Philip Chen, his chief financial officer, a man Richard had trusted implicitly for nearly 8 years. But there was tension in Philip's tone that set off alarm bells in Richard's mind. There had been unusual activity detected in several of the company's secured accounts, digital signatures that did not match standard protocols, access attempts that appeared legitimate but occurred at irregular hours from locations that made no sense. Richard's jaw tightened as he listened. He had built Montgomery Technologies from the ground up, transforming a small software startup into a major player in cybersecurity and data management. The company's reputation was built on ironclad protection of client information. Any breach, any hint of vulnerability could destroy everything he had worked for. But even as Philip spoke, even as the implications became clear, Richard felt a strange detachment. Yesterday, this news would have sent him into crisis mode, would have had him booking the next flight to wherever he needed to be to contain the damage. Today, standing in the hallway outside his daughter's room, hearing her soft voice as she talked to Martha about the pancakes, his priorities had shifted. He told Philip to secure what they could, to bring in their best forensic team, but that he would not be coming into the office today. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of surprised silence. Richard Montgomery never missed a crisis. He was always the first one in, the last one to leave, the man who steered the ship through every storm. Philip started to protest, to explain the urgency, but Richard cut him off gently. He had something more important to handle. Philip would need to take point on this, at least for now. After ending the call, Richard leaned against the wall, processing the information. Corporate espionage was not unheard of in their industry, but the timing felt wrong, suspicious. He had enemies, certainly, competitors who resented his success, former partners who felt slighted by decisions made years ago. One name in particular surfaced in his mind, a man he had deliberately pushed from his thoughts for too long, David Thornton. They had been co-founders once, back when Montgomery Technologies was just an idea sketched on napkins in a college dorm room. But David had wanted to take shortcuts, to compromise on the principles that Richard held sacred. When Richard had bought him out, offering a generous settlement that David had initially accepted, he had thought the matter was closed. But David had a way of holding grudges, of nursing resentment, until it fermented into something toxic. Could he be behind this? The thought seemed paranoid, yet it nagged at Richard's instincts. He returned to Emma's room to find her finishing the last of her breakfast, a bit of color returning to her pale cheeks. Martha had opened the curtains fully, allowing the September sunshine to flood the space, and for a moment, Richard could almost pretend that yesterday had not happened, that his world had not been turned inside out. But then he saw the crutch leaning against the bedside table, and the memory came rushing back. Victoria's cruelty, Emma's tears, the years of absence that had allowed this situation to fester. Martha gestured for him to follow her into the hallway. Once they were out of Emma's earshot, the housekeeper's expression turned grave. She had things to tell him, she said. Things she had witnessed over the past year that she had tried to address with Victoria directly, but had been dismissed. Threatened, even. Victoria had made it clear that if Martha spoke to Richard about their interactions, she would find herself unemployed, her reputation smeared in ways that would make finding new work impossible. Richard listened, as Martha described a pattern of behavior that made his stomach turn. Victoria had been systematically undermining Emma's confidence, criticizing everything from the way she walked to the way she spoke, comparing her unfavorably to other children, to the memory of Catherine in ways that were designed to hurt rather than honor. She had hidden Emma's favorite toys, claiming they were too childish. She had cancelled appointments with the physical therapist, saying they were unnecessary expenses. She had isolated the girl, discouraging friendships, making excuses why Emma could not attend birthday parties or school events. And there was something else, Martha added, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. She had found Victoria in Catherine's old study several times, the room that Richard had kept locked since his first wife's passing, unable to face the memories contained within. Victoria had somehow obtained a key and had been going through Catherine's belongings, taking items, wearing her clothes, her perfume. It was unsettling, Martha said, obsessive, as if Victoria was trying to become Catherine, to replace her completely. But when that proved impossible, when Richard remained emotionally distant, when Emma remained a living reminder of the woman Victoria could never be, the obsession had curdled into resentment. Richard felt sick. How had he missed all of this? How had he been so blind? But he knew the answer. He had not wanted to see. Looking would have required him to acknowledge his own grief, his own failure to process Catherine's sudden departure from their lives. Remarrying Victoria had been a way to paper over the wound, to pretend that life could return to something resembling normal if he just kept moving forward, kept building, kept achieving. Martha mentioned that she knew of a specialist, a pediatric physical therapist who had an excellent reputation for working with children who had experienced trauma, both physical and emotional. Dr. Sarah Chen had offices in New Haven and came highly recommended. Perhaps it would be good for Emma to see someone who could help with both her mobility and her mental well-being. Richard nodded, grateful for the practical suggestion, for something concrete he could do immediately. As Martha left to attend to household tasks, Richard's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief, cryptic. "We need to talk about your security breach. Not safe to discuss on regular channels. Meet me at the usual coffee shop. Come alone." It was unsigned, but Richard recognized the phrasing, the way the words were structured. It had to be someone from his inner circle, someone who knew about the breach and had information they did not want to share through official company channels. The usual coffee shop was a small place downtown, a spot where Richard occasionally met with contacts who preferred discretion. He had not been there in months, maybe longer, but the message sender apparently remembered. Richard hesitated. He did not want to leave Emma, not now, not when she needed him most. But if there was critical information about the security breach, information that could protect not just his company, but potentially his family, he needed to hear it. He returned to Emma's room and explained that he needed to step out for an hour, maybe two, but that Martha would be here and that he would be back before lunch. He promised. Emma looked at him with those wide, questioning eyes, and he could see the fear there, the worry that he might not return, that this might be like all the other times, when a business emergency had pulled him away for days or weeks. He knelt beside her bed and took her small hands in his. He gave her his word, looking directly into her eyes, speaking slowly and clearly. He would be back. This was not like before. Things had changed. She was his priority now. Everything else came second. She nodded, not entirely convinced but willing to trust if only tentatively. Richard kissed her forehead and stood, feeling the weight of that promise settle on his shoulders. He would keep it. No matter what the meeting revealed, no matter what crisis emerged at the office, he would be back within 2 hours. James was waiting by the car when Richard came downstairs. The driver's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a wariness that had not been there before yesterday. As they pulled out of the driveway, Richard asked James directly what he knew about Victoria's behavior toward Emma. The older man's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He had seen things, he admitted. Harsh words when they thought no one was listening. The way Victoria would walk past Emma as if the child were invisible. Once he had witnessed Victoria deliberately trip Emma in the hallway, then berate her for being clumsy. He had wanted to say something, but Victoria had reminded him that she was the lady of the house, that his employment depended on discretion and loyalty. Richard closed his eyes, absorbing this information. Another person who had known, who had seen, who had been silenced by fear and manipulation. He told James that those days were over. If the driver ever saw anything that concerned him, anything at all related to Emma's welfare, he was to come to Richard immediately. No more silence. No more secrets. The coffee shop was busy when they arrived, filled with the morning rush of professionals grabbing their caffeine before heading to offices throughout the city. Richard scanned the room and spotted a familiar face in the corner booth. Michael Torres, one of his senior security analysts, a man who had been with the company for 5 years and had always demonstrated unwavering loyalty and exceptional skill. But Michael looked nervous now, his eyes darting around the room as if checking for surveillance. Richard slid into the booth across from him. Michael wasted no time with pleasantries. He had been monitoring the network intrusions that Philip had reported, and he had found something disturbing. The access attempts were not coming from external hackers. They were originating from inside the company, from authenticated accounts belonging to legitimate employees. Someone within Montgomery Technologies was actively stealing data, copying proprietary algorithms, client lists, security protocols, and based on the timestamps and patterns, it appeared to be coordinated, possibly involving multiple people. But there was more. Michael had done some digging on his own, off the official network, using methods that were not exactly approved but were effective. He had traced some of the data exfiltration to a server farm owned by a shell company. And when he looked into that shell company's ownership structure, peeling back layers of corporate obfuscation, he had found a name that made everything click into place. David Thornton. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. David, his former partner, the man he had pushed out of the company a decade ago. It seemed impossible that David could still be harboring such intense resentment after all this time, that he would orchestrate something this elaborate and potentially devastating. But Michael had proof, at least enough to warrant serious investigation. There were financial transfers between the shell company and an account linked to one of Montgomery Technologies' own employees, a man named Brian Foster, who worked in the IT department and had access to nearly every system in the company. Michael slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were printouts of the transactions, screenshots of the suspicious account activity, and a grainy photograph taken in the parking garage showing Brian Foster handing an envelope to someone Michael had identified as an associate of David Thornton's. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Richard thanked Michael for his initiative, his willingness to take risks to protect the company, but he warned the analyst to be careful, to keep this information secure, to trust no one else until they knew the full extent of the conspiracy. As Richard left the coffee shop, his mind was racing. The security breach was not just a random attack. It was a coordinated assault, orchestrated by someone who knew the company's vulnerabilities intimately, someone who had inside help, someone who wanted to destroy everything Richard had built. And if David Thornton was behind this, if he had been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to strike, then what else might he be planning? What other vulnerabilities might he be targeting? Richard checked his watch. 1 hour had passed since he left home. He had promised Emma he would be back soon, and he intended to keep that promise. But as James drove him back through the tree-lined streets of Greenwich, Richard could not shake the feeling that the world was closing in from multiple directions. His personal life had imploded with the revelation of Victoria's cruelty. His professional life was under attack from a vengeful former partner. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos was a frightened 8-year-old girl who needed her father to hold everything together, to be strong, to protect her from forces she could not possibly understand. When he arrived home, Emma was in the living room with Martha, working on a puzzle. The simple normalcy of the scene was almost jarring after the intensity of the meeting with Michael. Emma looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her face brightened with relief, and something that might have been the beginning of trust. He had come back. He had kept his promise. It was a small thing, but to Emma, Richard understood, it was everything. He sat down beside her and helped with the puzzle, his hands finding the right pieces almost automatically, while his mind continued to process the information Michael had shared. He needed to act, to protect his company, to stop David Thornton's plan before it could do irreparable damage. But he also needed to be here, to protect Emma, to begin repairing the damage that years of neglect and Victoria's malice had caused. How could he do both? How could he be in 2 places at once? The answer, he realized, was that he could not. He had to choose. And for the first time in his professional life, the choice was clear. Emma came first. The company would have to survive without him at the helm for a while. He had good people, people like Philip and Michael who could handle the crisis. But Emma had only him. She had no one else to turn to, no one else to protect her. He had failed her once by prioritizing work over family. He would not make that mistake again. Chapter 3. Across town, in a dimly lit bar that catered to a clientele more interested in discretion than ambiance, Victoria Montgomery sat in a corner booth, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her lap, her perfectly manicured nails tapping an agitated rhythm against the leather. She had spent the night at the Plaza Hotel, using a credit card that was still linked to Richard's accounts, ordering room service and expensive wine to numb the shock and humiliation of being cast out of her own home in front of the most influential people in Connecticut's social circles. Her phone had been ringing constantly. Text messages from so-called friends, people who had smiled at her just hours ago, now sending carefully worded inquiries that were really just attempts to gather gossip. By morning, the story would be everywhere. Victoria Ashford Montgomery, the woman who had clawed her way up from a modest background to marry one of the wealthiest tech moguls on the East Coast, had been publicly expelled from her own home. The shame of it burned hotter than any anger she felt toward Richard. A man slid into the booth across from her. He was younger than Victoria by at least 10 years, with the kind of practiced charm that came from years of using his looks to extract money and favors from women who should have known better. His name was Marcus Steele, though Victoria suspected that was not the name on his birth certificate. She had met him 6 months ago at a gallery opening, had been flattered by his attention, had allowed herself a brief and regrettable affair that had ended when she realized he was more interested in her connections and bank account than in her. Marcus smiled, that same easy grin that had once made her feel young and desirable. He had heard about last night, he said. The whole city had heard about it by now. Social media was ablaze with speculation and second-hand accounts from guests at the gala. Some were sympathetic to Victoria, painting her as the victim of an ungrateful child and an unstable husband. Others were less kind, suggesting she had gotten exactly what she deserved. Victoria wanted to snap at him, to tell him to leave her alone, but she had called him, had reached out in a moment of desperation because she had nowhere else to turn. Her own family had distanced themselves from her years ago when she had made it clear that she was embarrassed by their blue-collar roots. The society friends she had cultivated were already pulling away, not wanting to be associated with scandal. Marcus was sleazy and opportunistic, but at least he was here. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He had an idea, he said. A way for Victoria to regain her position, to hurt Richard where it would devastate him most, and to secure a financial settlement that would set her up for life. But it would require Victoria to be willing to play dirty, to ally herself with people who had their own reasons for wanting to see Richard Montgomery destroyed. Victoria listened as Marcus explained. He had connections, he claimed, people who moved in different circles, people who understood how to manipulate media narratives and public opinion. And more importantly, he knew someone who had been waiting for years for an opportunity to strike at Richard, a former business partner who felt he had been cheated, who had been building resources and contacts, waiting for the perfect moment to exact revenge. David Thornton. The name meant nothing to Victoria at first, but as Marcus filled in the details, she began to understand. David Thornton had co-founded Montgomery Technologies with Richard, had been pushed out in what he considered a hostile takeover disguised as a buyout, and had spent the last decade building his own tech company while nursing a profound grudge. He had money now, influence, and a network of people who owed him favors, and he had been monitoring Richard's life, looking for weaknesses, waiting for an opening. Victoria's expulsion from the Montgomery household was exactly the opening David had been waiting for. A disgruntled ex-wife with intimate knowledge of Richard's personal life, his routines, his vulnerabilities, someone who could provide information, who could help orchestrate a campaign that would destroy Richard's reputation while simultaneously attacking his business from the inside. Marcus had already reached out to David on Victoria's behalf, he explained. David was interested, very interested. A third person joined them at the booth. He was older than Marcus but younger than Victoria, dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as successful but not ostentatious. His handshake was firm, his smile measured. He introduced himself as David Thornton, and Victoria felt a chill run through her as she met his eyes. They were cold, calculating, the eyes of someone who had long ago learned to mask emotion behind a veneer of professional courtesy. David ordered drinks for the table and then got straight to business. He explained that he had been working for months to infiltrate Montgomery Technologies, to plant people inside the company who could feed him information and create chaos. The security breaches that Richard had discovered were just the beginning. But to really bring Richard down, David needed to attack him on multiple fronts, professionally and personally. The business vulnerabilities would destroy his company, but to truly break him, they needed to go after what he valued most: his reputation, his relationship with his daughter, the public image he had carefully cultivated as a genius entrepreneur and devoted single father who had rebuilt his life after tragedy. Victoria listened, her heart pounding. Part of her recoiled at the coldness of the plan, at the idea of using Emma as a pawn in this game of revenge. But another part of her, the part that had been humiliated and cast aside, that had spent years trying to live up to the ghost of Catherine Montgomery, and failing, that part wanted Richard to suffer as she was suffering. He had made her look like a fool. He had believed the word of a child and a housekeeper over his own wife. He had destroyed her social standing in a single evening. Why should she show him any mercy? David laid out the strategy. They would launch a media campaign painting Richard as a neglectful father who had been too focused on his business to notice his daughter's needs. Victoria would position herself as the caring stepmother who had tried to help, but had been pushed away by a man who could not handle criticism or admit his failures. They would leak carefully selected information to tabloid reporters, to social media influencers, to anyone who could help shape the narrative. And while the public relations battle raged, David's people inside Montgomery Technologies would continue to sabotage operations, steal data, and create problems that would make investors nervous and clients suspicious. The goal was not just to wound Richard, David explained. It was to destroy him completely, to take everything he had built and reduce it to ashes. And then, when Richard was at his lowest, when he had lost his company and his reputation, when he was struggling to hold on to custody of his daughter, David would swoop in and buy the remains of Montgomery Technologies for pennies on the dollar. He would own Richard's life's work. It would be the ultimate revenge. Victoria asked what was in it for her. David smiled, that cold, calculated expression that never reached his eyes. Financial compensation, of course. Generous settlement that would come from Richard's accounts and assets. But more than that, David said, Victoria would have the satisfaction of watching Richard lose everything. Was that not worth something? Was that not what she wanted after the humiliation he had inflicted on her? Victoria thought about Emma's face, tear-streaked and desperate on the lawn. She thought about Richard's expression as he had confronted her, the disgust in his eyes, the finality in his voice when he had ordered her to leave. She thought about Catherine, the perfect wife, the beloved mother, the woman whose memory Victoria had tried so hard to erase and whose presence still haunted every corner of that house. And she thought about the society friends who were already whispering behind her back, the invitations that would stop coming, the life she had built that was crumbling around her. She agreed. She would help David destroy Richard Montgomery, whatever it took. Marcus grinned, pleased with himself for bringing them together. David signaled the waiter for another round of drinks. They spent the next 2 hours planning, coordinating their stories, identifying weaknesses they could exploit. David had already drafted false narratives that would be released to friendly journalists. Marcus had contacts at several gossip websites and entertainment news channels. Victoria provided insights into Richard's schedule, his habits, the people he trusted. She drew from memory the layout of the house, where Richard kept important documents. Which of the staff members might be sympathetic to her version of events? By the time they left the bar, a plan was in motion. David's inside man at Montgomery Technologies, Brian Foster, would escalate the sabotage over the coming days. Victoria would record a tearful video confession that would be strategically leaked to social media, portraying herself as a victim. Marcus would work his connections to ensure the story gained traction in the right circles. And David would continue to orchestrate the dismantling of Richard's business empire from behind the scenes, using shell companies and proxies to hide his involvement. Meanwhile, at the Montgomery mansion, Martha was conducting her own investigation. Something had been nagging at her since yesterday's confrontation. She had seen Victoria's reaction when Richard had ordered her out of the house, had noticed the flash of calculation beneath the shock. The way Victoria's mind had immediately started working on some plan, even as she protested her innocence. Martha had worked for wealthy families long enough to recognize when someone was truly remorseful and when they were simply regrouping. After ensuring Emma was settled for the afternoon with a book and some drawing supplies, Martha returned to Victoria's former bedroom. The police had not been called. There was no crime scene, so the room remained essentially as Victoria had left it. She had taken her clothes and jewelry, her personal items, but had been forced to leave in such haste that surely something had been overlooked. Martha searched systematically, checking drawers and closets, looking under the bed and behind furniture. In the back of the closet, hidden behind a row of evening gowns, she found a locked trunk that she did not recognize. It was expensive, made of dark wood with brass fittings, and it looked old, like something from another era. Martha tried several keys from Victoria's abandoned keyring before finding one that fit. Inside the trunk, Martha discovered things that made her blood run cold. There were items belonging to Catherine Montgomery, things that Richard had kept in his late wife's study, things that should never have been removed. Photographs had been defaced, Catherine's face scratched out or covered. There were journals, Catherine's private writings from the years before her passing, with pages torn out and notes scribbled in the margins in Victoria's distinctive handwriting. Most disturbing were the clothes, Catherine's favorite dresses and scarves, all tailored to fit Victoria's slightly larger frame, stained with makeup and perfume as if Victoria had been wearing them, trying to become the woman whose place she had taken. But there was more. Tucked beneath the clothing was a USB drive. Martha pulled it out, turning the small device over in her hands. She knew she should give it to Richard immediately, but curiosity got the better of her. She took the drive to the study, locked the door and plugged it into the computer. The files on the drive painted a damning picture. There were videos, taken by the security cameras Victoria had secretly installed throughout the house, showing her accessing Richard's computer late at night when he was away on business trips. The footage showed her using some kind of device to bypass his passwords, downloading files, photographing documents. There were folders full of these downloaded files, proprietary information about Montgomery Technologies, client lists, strategic plans, financial projections. But even more incriminating were the chat logs, conversations between Victoria and people Martha did not recognize. Discussions about the best times to access Richard's office. Exchanges about payment schedules, about how much information was worth, about the ultimate goal of destroying Montgomery Technologies from within. And there, in black, and white was David Thornton's name, along with discussions about how he planned to use the stolen information to undermine Richard's business, while simultaneously launching a public relations campaign to destroy his personal reputation. Martha's hands shook as she scrolled through the evidence. Victoria had not just been a cruel stepmother. She had been a spy, actively working to betray the man she had married, stealing from him, collaborating with his enemies. And the plan extended beyond just corporate espionage. There were messages discussing Emma, ways to use the child to hurt Richard, suggestions about how to manufacture evidence of neglect or abuse that could be used in a custody battle. Martha ejected the USB drive and held it tightly in her fist. This was bigger than she had imagined. This was not just about a failed marriage or a woman's cruelty toward a stepchild. This was conspiracy, theft, possibly even grounds for prosecution. Richard needed to see this immediately. But Martha knew she had to be careful. If Victoria or her allies suspected that their plans had been discovered, they might accelerate their timeline, might do something desperate and dangerous. She placed the USB drive in her pocket and left the study, making sure to lock it behind her. As she walked down the hallway, she passed Emma's room and heard the girl humming softly to herself, a tuneless melody that spoke of a child trying to comfort herself in the midst of uncertainty. Martha's resolve hardened. Whatever happened next, Emma had to be protected. The little girl had already been through too much. She deserved to grow up safe, loved, without the shadow of these adult machinations hanging over her head. Martha found Richard in his home office, on the phone with his lawyers, discussing custody arrangements and legal separation from Victoria. When he ended the call, Martha closed the door and handed him the USB drive. She explained where she had found it, what it contained and what it meant. As Richard plugged the drive into his computer and began reviewing the files, his expression shifted from confusion to shock to cold fury. This was worse than the security breach Michael Torres had reported. This was betrayal on a profound and personal level. Victoria had not just been cruel to Emma. She had actively worked to destroy everything he had built, had allied herself with his enemies, had stolen from him while sharing his home and his bed. Richard made a decision. He would not confront Victoria directly. That would only tip his hand and give her time to destroy evidence or flee. Instead, he would work with his legal team and with law enforcement to build a case, to document every aspect of the conspiracy, to ensure that when he moved against Victoria and David Thornton, and whoever else was involved, the response would be swift, comprehensive and legally unassailable. He would protect Emma, protect his company, and make sure that the people who had tried to destroy his family faced consequences for their actions. Chapter 4. The attack came at dawn, launched across multiple platforms simultaneously in a coordinated strike that bore all the hallmarks of professional crisis manufacturing. Richard's phone began buzzing incessantly at 6 in the morning. Alerts from his publicist, his legal team, board members, friends, all directing him to the same nightmare unfolding across social media and news websites. The headline on Connecticut Today's gossip section screamed in bold letters, "Tech mogul's dark secret. Stepmother reveals years of neglect and emotional manipulation." Below it was a photograph of Victoria, her eyes red and swollen, makeup artfully smudged to suggest genuine tears. The article painted a devastating portrait of Richard as an absent father who had been so consumed by his business empire that he had ignored his disabled daughter's needs, leaving her in the care of a stepmother who had tried her best but had been constantly undermined and eventually scapegoated for the family's dysfunction. But the article was just the beginning. On social media, a video was circulating that had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times in just a few hours. In it, Victoria sat in what appeared to be a modest hotel room, dressed simply in a way that contrasted sharply with the designer gowns she typically wore. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice trembling with emotion as she described her attempts to care for Emma, to provide structure and discipline that the child desperately needed. only to be met with resistance from a man who refused to acknowledge his own failures as a parent. Victoria's performance was masterful. She never directly accused Richard of anything actionable, nothing that could be definitively proven false. Instead, she spoke in generalities about his absences, his business trips, the way he had turned to work as a way of avoiding the pain of his past. She positioned herself as the woman who had tried to love a broken family back to wholeness, only to be cast aside when she dared to suggest that Richard needed to be more present in his daughter's life. The comments section beneath the video was filled with messages of support. People condemning Richard without knowing any of the facts, ready to believe the worst because it fit a familiar narrative about wealthy men who prioritized money over family. Richard sat at his desk, his coffee growing cold as he scrolled through the coverage, watching his reputation unravel in real time. The board of directors at Montgomery Technologies had already called an emergency meeting. Several major clients had sent concerned emails, questioning whether the leadership instability at the company might affect service delivery. Investors were nervous. Stock prices would probably take a hit when the markets opened. But worse than any of that was the knowledge that Emma would see this. Her classmates' parents would see it. Her teachers would see it. The entire community would be talking about it. She would face questions, stares, whispers. The very thing he had been trying to protect her from, public scrutiny and judgment, was now unavoidable. Martha found him in the office, her face drawn with worry. She had already received calls from several other households in the neighborhood, people she knew from church and community groups, asking if the news reports were true, if Richard had really been neglectful, if Victoria had really been trying to help. Martha had defended him fiercely, but she could tell that many people were already forming their opinions based on headlines and a tearful video. Richard made several calls. First to Jennifer Walsh, his attorney, a woman with a reputation for aggressive litigation and zero tolerance for false narratives. Jennifer had already been reviewing the evidence from the USB drive that Martha had found, and she assured Richard that they had more than enough to prove Victoria's malice and dishonesty. But she warned him that the court of public opinion operated differently than a court of law. They would need to be strategic about their response, careful not to appear defensive or vindictive while also setting the record straight. Next, he called Frank Henderson, a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and white-collar criminal cases. Richard had worked with Frank once before, years ago, when a competitor had tried to poach his entire engineering team. Frank was thorough, discreet, and had connections throughout law enforcement. Richard explained the situation, the evidence they had gathered, the names involved. Frank listened carefully, and then promised to start digging immediately. If David Thornton was behind this, if he had been coordinating with Victoria and had planted people inside Montgomery Technologies, Frank would find the proof. The investigator also suggested something else. They needed to check the house for surveillance devices. If Victoria had been secretly recording inside the home, there might be other cameras or listening devices they had not yet discovered. Frank would send a team over that afternoon to sweep the entire property. Richard agreed, feeling a sick sensation in his stomach at the thought that Victoria had been watching, recording, gathering ammunition for months or even years. Before Emma woke up, Richard sat down with Martha to discuss how they would handle the day. Emma would need to be told something, prepared for the possibility that other children at school might say things, might repeat what their parents had been discussing over breakfast. But they needed to frame it in a way that would not frighten her, that would not make her feel responsible for the adult conflicts swirling around her. Martha suggested keeping Emma home from school for a few days, giving things time to settle, but Richard shook his head. Running and hiding would only make Emma feel like they had something to be ashamed of. They had done nothing wrong. Victoria was the one who had been cruel, dishonest, criminal. They would not let her force them into isolation. When Emma came downstairs for breakfast, she was quieter than usual, moving slowly with her crutch, her eyes cautious, as if she was waiting for something bad to happen. Richard pulled out a chair for her and sat down across the table. He explained as simply as he could that Victoria was saying untrue things about their family, trying to make herself look good by making him look bad. Some people might believe her because they did not know the whole story, but the truth would come out eventually. In the meantime, If anyone at school said something mean or asked uncomfortable questions, Emma should tell her teacher and they would handle it. He emphasized that none of this was her fault, that she had done nothing wrong, that he was proud of her and would always protect her. Emma listened carefully, processing the information. Then she asked a question that broke Richard's heart. Did people think she was lying? Did they think she had made up the story about Victoria being mean? Richard assured her that anyone who mattered, anyone who knew her, understood that she was telling the truth. The people who believed Victoria's lies did not know them, had never seen how brave and strong Emma was. Their opinions did not matter. What mattered was that they knew the truth, and they would stand by it together. At Montgomery Technologies headquarters, Philip Chen was dealing with his own crisis. The security breaches had escalated overnight, with several more instances of unauthorized data access flagged by the monitoring systems. The IT department was in chaos, trying to identify the source while also maintaining operations for legitimate clients. Philip had ordered a complete audit of all employee access credentials, a process that would take days and disrupt normal workflows, but it was necessary. They could not continue operating while someone was actively stealing their most valuable assets. Brian Foster, the IT employee that Michael Torres had identified as suspicious, had called in sick that morning. His absence was noted, flagged as potentially significant. Philip authorized Frank Henderson's team to investigate Foster's activities more closely, including obtaining phone records and surveillance footage from areas where he had been spotted meeting with unknown individuals. At exactly 9 o'clock, the legal team that Jennifer Walsh had assembled arrived at Richard's home. There were 4 attorneys, each specializing in a different aspect of the case. One focused on family law and custody issues, another handled corporate litigation and trade secret theft. A third was an expert in defamation and media law. The fourth specialized in white-collar investigations and had connections with federal prosecutors who might be interested in the scope of the conspiracy against Montgomery Technologies. They spent 3 hours reviewing all the evidence, watching the security footage from Victoria's USB drive, reading through the chat logs that revealed her coordination with David Thornton, examining financial records that showed suspicious transfers and payments. The attorneys agreed that they had grounds for multiple legal actions. They could pursue Victoria for theft of trade secrets, for attempted fraud, potentially even for conspiracy to commit corporate sabotage. David Thornton could be charged as an accomplice, and Brian Foster's involvement constituted a clear violation of his employment contract and potentially criminal statutes related to computer fraud. But Jennifer cautioned patience. If they moved too quickly, if they tipped their hand before gathering all the evidence and securing witness testimony, the conspirators might destroy evidence or flee. She recommended a methodical approach. First, secure search warrants for Victoria's hotel room, for David Thornton's office and home, for Brian Foster's residence and personal devices. Second, depose witnesses who might have information, including employees at Montgomery Technologies who had noticed unusual behavior from Foster. Third, prepare a comprehensive media response that would counter Victoria's narrative without appearing vindictive. While the legal team worked, Frank Henderson's surveillance team arrived to sweep the Montgomery mansion. They found 3 hidden cameras that Victoria had installed, one in Richard's home office, one in the master bedroom, and one in the hallway outside Emma's room. Each camera was wireless, transmitting to a receiver that Victoria must have taken with her when she left, but the devices themselves contained memory cards with weeks of recorded footage. The team also found a keylogger attached to Richard's computer, a device that had been recording every password and keystroke he made. The discovery was both validating and deeply disturbing. Victoria had been systematically spying on him, on Emma, gathering information that could be used against them. The footage from the hallway camera might even show Victoria's interactions with Emma, the moments of cruelty that Martha had described. Richard authorized the team to preserve all the footage and turn it over to law enforcement as evidence. By midday, the story had evolved. Several of the guests who had been at the gala were now coming forward with their own accounts, posting on social media about what they had actually witnessed that night. A prominent socialite named Caroline Whitmore who had been standing near the terrace when Richard confronted Victoria, wrote a detailed thread describing the scene, how she had seen Emma on the ground crying, how Victoria had walked away without helping, how Richard's response had been that of a father protecting his child. Caroline's account was measured, factual, and carried weight because of her own reputation in the community. Other witnesses followed. A couple who had been in the garden described hearing Victoria speak harshly to Emma minutes before Richard arrived. Their business associate of Richard's posted about his character, his dedication to his company and his employees, countering the narrative that he was negligent or cruel. The tide of public opinion was beginning to shift slowly. As people who actually knew the family spoke up against the manufactured story Victoria had tried to sell. At school, Emma's day was difficult, but not as terrible as Richard had feared. Her teacher, Mrs. Robertson, a kind woman in her 50s who had taught at the private academy for 20 years, was aware of the news coverage. She pulled Emma aside during recess and assured her that she was safe, that if anyone bothered her, they would face consequences. Several of Emma's classmates did ask questions, some innocently curious, others cruelly parroting things they had heard from their parents. But Emma remembered what her father had told her. She said simply that her stepmother had been mean and had lied, and that her father was taking care of everything. Mrs. Robertson nodded approvingly and made a mental note to contact Richard, to offer whatever support the school could provide. That evening, Richard sat with Emma in the garden, the same place where everything had changed just 2 days ago. The grass had been freshly mowed, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Emma was tired from the emotional weight of the day, but she seemed more settled, as if speaking the truth to her classmates had been empowering rather than frightening. Richard told her about the therapist Martha had recommended, Dr. Sarah Chen. He explained that Dr. Chen helped children who had been hurt, both in their bodies and their hearts, to feel better and stronger. Emma asked if it would hurt, if there would be needles or medicine. Richard promised that it would not hurt, that it would mostly be talking and exercises, gentle movements to help her leg get stronger, and conversations to help her feel happier. Emma considered this and then nodded. She would try it, she said. She wanted to get better. She wanted to be able to run like the other kids, to not need the crutch anymore. Richard felt a swell of pride and hope. Despite everything she had been through, Emma was still fighting, still believing in the possibility of healing and improvement. He promised her that they would do this together, that he would be with her every step of the way, that she would never face these challenges alone again. Inside the house, Martha was preparing dinner when her phone rang. It was a woman she knew from her previous employment, another housekeeper who worked for a family in Victoria's social circle. The woman spoke in hushed tones, saying she had heard things, seen things that Martha should know about. Victoria had been at a restaurant that morning with 2 men, one young and flashy, the other older and coldly professional. They had been discussing Richard, talking about ways to increase pressure, to make things worse before they got better. The housekeeper had not heard all the details, but it was clear they were planning something, coordinating their next move. Martha thanked her friend and immediately relayed the information to Richard. He was not surprised. Victoria had shown herself to be vindictive and calculating. Of course she would not stop with one media blitz. She would keep pushing, keep trying to find ways to hurt him, to turn public opinion against him, to damage his business and his relationship with Emma. But now that Richard knew what he was facing, now that he had evidence and legal support and investigators tracking every move, he was ready. The war Victoria had started would not end the way she hoped. Instead, it would end with her facing the consequences of her own cruelty and deception. Late that night, after Emma was asleep and the house was quiet, Richard stood in his home office, reviewing everything they had gathered. The videos from the hidden cameras, the chat log showing coordination between Victoria and David Thornton, the financial records proving Brian Foster had been paid for stealing company secrets, the witness statements from the gala. The evidence was overwhelming, comprehensive, damning. Jennifer Walsh was confident that they could get search warrants executed within 48 hours. That law enforcement would move quickly once they understood the scope of the conspiracy. Richard thought about the path ahead. There would be more media attention, more scrutiny, more difficult days. The legal proceedings would be complex and probably lengthy. David Thornton would fight back, would use his own resources and connections to try to muddy the waters. But Richard was determined, not for revenge, though he would be lying if he said there was not a part of him that wanted to see Victoria in. David faced justice, but more than that, he was fighting for Emma, for her future, for her right to grow up safe and protected, without the shadow of Victoria's malice hanging over her, for her chance to heal, both physically and emotionally, and to become the strong, confident person he knew she could be. That was what mattered. That was worth fighting for, and fight he would with everything he had, until his daughter was truly and finally safe. Chapter 5. The search warrants were executed simultaneously at 7 in the morning, a coordinated operation involving local police, federal investigators, and private security teams hired by Montgomery Technologies. At the Plaza Hotel, Victoria answered the door to find 4 officers and 2 FBI agents standing in the hallway, legal documents in hand. Her face, still puffy from sleep and last night's drinking, went pale as they explained that they had authorization to search her room and seize any electronic devices, documents or materials related to the theft of trade secrets from Montgomery Technologies. Marcus Steele, who had spent the night in Victoria's room, tried to object, positioning himself between Victoria and the officers with the bravado of someone who had watched too many crime dramas and misunderstood his own importance in the situation. An officer calmly informed him that obstruction would result in additional charges, and Marcus quickly stepped aside, his earlier confidence evaporating as the reality of federal involvement became clear. This was not a domestic dispute or a messy separation. This was a criminal investigation into corporate espionage and conspiracy. The agents worked methodically, photographing everything before touching it, bagging Victoria's laptop, her phone, a tablet they found hidden in her luggage, and several thumb drives in her purse. They found printouts of documents that clearly came from Richard's personal files, handwritten notes in Victoria's distinctive script detailing meeting times and dates that corresponded exactly with the suspicious data access at Montgomery Technologies. One agent discovered a burner phone taped to the underside of a drawer, a device that Victoria had apparently been using to communicate with her co-conspirators in ways she thought could not be traced. Victoria demanded to call her lawyer, her voice rising to a near shriek as she realized how thoroughly her plans had been uncovered. The lead agent calmly informed her that she was certainly entitled to legal representation, but that the search would continue regardless. They were executing a valid warrant based on probable cause, and nothing she said or did would stop the process. Marcus tried to film the proceedings with his phone, but an officer confiscated the device as potential evidence, explaining that any recordings he had made might be relevant to the investigation. Across town, at David Thornton's sprawling estate in the wealthy enclave of Riverside, a similar scene was unfolding. David answered the door in his robe, coffee cup in hand, and his practiced composure cracked immediately when he saw the badges and legal papers. His attorney, whom he had called the moment he saw the first police vehicle pull up his driveway, arrived 20 minutes into the search and could only watch as investigators dismantled David's home office, seizing computers, filing cabinets full of documents, and most damning, a safe that contained cash payments marked with dates and names that corresponded to Brian Foster's employment at Montgomery Technologies. David tried to maintain his businessman persona, speaking calmly about misunderstandings and legal procedures, suggesting that this was all an overreaction by a competitor who could not handle legitimate business pressure. But the lead investigator, a veteran FBI agent named Sarah Martinez, who had built a career on dismantling corporate fraud schemes, was not impressed. She had reviewed the evidence that Richard's legal team had provided, had seen the chat logs and financial transfers, had traced the digital breadcrumbs that led directly back to David's network of shell companies and offshore accounts. This was not ambiguous. This was not a gray area. This was clear, prosecutable conspiracy. At Brian Foster's apartment in Stamford, the young IT specialist was caught trying to flee. He had packed a hasty bag and was heading for his car when police pulled into the parking lot. The laptop bag slung over his shoulder contained external hard drives filled with stolen Montgomery Technologies data, including proprietary algorithms worth millions of dollars. In his wallet, investigators found receipts from wire transfers totaling over $300,000, payments that had been made over the course of 18 months. Brian tried to claim he did not know what was on the drives, that he was just holding them for a friend, but the evidence spoke for itself. His own email account, accessed on his personal devices, contained clear instructions from David Thornton about what information to steal and when to extract it. By noon, the news networks had picked up the story, but now the narrative had shifted dramatically. Instead of headlines about a neglectful father, the coverage focused on the elaborate conspiracy to sabotage Montgomery Technologies and falsely destroy Richard Montgomery's reputation. Legal analysts appeared on cable news explaining the severity of the charges, the potential prison time for corporate espionage and trade secret theft. Victoria's tearful video, which had seemed so compelling just 24 hours ago, now looked like what it was: a calculated performance by someone desperate to cover her own criminal actions. At the Montgomery mansion, Richard watched the coverage with a mixture of relief and residual anger. Relief that the truth was finally being told, that the investigators had moved quickly and effectively, that Victoria and her accomplices would face consequences. But also anger that any of this had been necessary, that Emma had been caught in the crossfire of adult greed and vindictiveness, that he had been so blind to Victoria's true nature for so long. Emma was in the living room with Martha, working on her art project, deliberately shielded from the television coverage. Richard had decided that she did not need to see or hear the details of the legal proceedings. It was enough for her to know that the adults who had tried to hurt their family were being held accountable. The specifics, the charges and evidence and legal maneuvering were not appropriate for an 8-year-old to process. She needed stability, normalcy, routine. She needed to focus on healing, not on the darkness that had briefly threatened to consume their lives. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at 2 in the afternoon for Emma's first appointment. She was a woman in her early 40s, with a warm smile and a gentle demeanor that immediately put Emma at ease. She had brought a bag full of colorful equipment, soft foam blocks and resistance bands and toys that looked more like games than medical devices. She explained to Emma that they would start slowly, just getting to know each other, understanding how Emma's leg felt on different days, what movements were comfortable and what caused discomfort. Richard watched from the doorway as Dr. Chen engaged Emma in what looked like play, but was actually careful assessment. She had Emma reach for different objects, shift her weight, balance on one foot while holding onto a sturdy bar. She never pushed, never forced, always offered encouragement and celebrated small successes. Within 30 minutes, Emma was laughing, genuinely enjoying the interaction, forgetting for a moment about everything else that had been happening. Dr. Chen spoke with Richard afterward, explaining her assessment and recommendations. Emma's physical limitations were significant, but not insurmountable. With consistent therapy, with proper exercises and gradual progression, there was real potential for improvement. She might never run marathons, but she could definitely gain more independence, more confidence in her mobility. The emotional component was equally important, Dr. Chen emphasized. Emma had been through trauma, both from the original accident that had injured her and from the subsequent mistreatment by Victoria. Building her physical strength needed to happen alongside building her emotional resilience and self-worth. Richard agreed to a schedule of 3 sessions per week, with home exercises to be done daily. Dr. Chen would also connect them with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, someone who could help Emma process what she had experienced and develop healthy coping mechanisms. Richard was committed to whatever Emma needed, whatever would help her heal and thrive. That evening, Jennifer Walsh called with an update. The prosecutors were extremely interested in the case. The evidence of corporate espionage was solid, and the coordination between Victoria, David Thornton, and Brian Foster constituted a clear conspiracy. The federal charges would likely take precedence over any state-level accusations, which meant this would be prosecuted aggressively. Victoria and David would face significant prison time if convicted, and even if they managed to negotiate plea deals, their reputations were destroyed beyond repair. But Jennifer had something else to tell him, something that made the legal victory feel even more complete. Victoria's attorney had called, inquiring about the possibility of a settlement. Victoria wanted to avoid trial, wanted to negotiate some kind of resolution that would keep her out of prison. Jennifer had been blunt in her response. There would be no settlement. Richard was not interested in making deals with someone who had abused his daughter and tried to destroy his life's work. Victoria could take her chances at trial, where a jury would see all the evidence, would hear testimony from Emma and Martha, and the other witnesses would understand exactly what she had done. The attorney had gone silent, understanding that his client had no leverage, no bargaining position. Similar overtures had come from David Thornton's legal team, equally desperate, equally rejected. David had gambled everything on his revenge scheme, and now he was facing the consequences. His own company's board of directors had voted to remove him, distancing themselves from the scandal. Investors were fleeing. Business partners were severing contracts. Everything he had built since leaving Montgomery Technologies was crumbling, and this time there would be no golden parachute, no generous buyout. Just legal liability and professional ruin. Brian Foster was cooperating with investigators, providing detailed testimony about how David had recruited him, how the payments had been structured, how the data theft had been coordinated. His cooperation might earn him a slightly reduced sentence, but he would still face years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy. And his testimony would be devastating for David and Victoria at trial, providing the kind of insider details that would make conviction nearly inevitable. Over the following days, a rhythm began to establish itself in the Montgomery household. Emma attended her therapy sessions with Dr. Chen, slowly building strength and confidence. She returned to school, where Mrs. Robertson had addressed the entire class about kindness and not believing rumors, creating a protective space where Emma could focus on learning rather than defending herself. Several of Emma's classmates, children who had been standoffish or curious in uncomfortable ways, now approached her with genuine friendship, inviting her to join games at recess and sit with them at lunch. Richard restructured his work schedule, delegating more responsibilities to his executive team and limiting his own hours at the office. Philip Chen proved more than capable of managing daily operations, and the crisis management team Richard had assembled handled the remaining fallout from the security breaches efficiently. Clients who had been nervous were reassured by the swift legal action and the comprehensive security overhaul that Montgomery Technologies implemented. The company's stock price, which had dipped during the initial scandal, rebounded strongly as investors recognized that Richard had eliminated the threat and emerged with his integrity intact. Martha continued to be the steady presence that held the household together, managing schedules and meals and the countless details that made daily life function smoothly. She had testified to investigators about what she had witnessed, providing crucial corroborating evidence for the charges against Victoria. And she had found a new sense of purpose in supporting Emma's recovery, researching recipes that would support the girl's nutritional needs during intensive physical therapy, creating a calm and nurturing environment in the home. James, the driver, had also played a small but important role in the investigation. He had provided testimony about Victoria's suspicious activities. The times he had driven her to meetings she claimed were charity functions, but which he had later realized were coordination sessions with David Thornton and Marcus Steele. He had witnessed enough to paint a picture of deception and planning that stretched back months before the final confrontation at the gala. In the garden behind the mansion, where this entire crisis had begun, Emma was making progress. With her new lighter crutch and the strengthening exercises Dr. Chen had prescribed, she was moving with more confidence. Richard had arranged for chalk to be available, and Emma enjoyed drawing colorful paths on the stone patio, setting goals for how far she could walk, celebrating each small victory. There were setbacks, days when her leg ached, or when the memories of Victoria's cruelty crept back into her thoughts. But Richard was always there, patient and present, offering encouragement without pressure, support without smothering. One afternoon, Emma surprised him by presenting a drawing she had made during art class at school. It showed two figures, one tall and one small, holding hands and walking toward a bright sun. The simplicity of it, the hope it represented, brought unexpected tears to Richard's eyes. He hung it in his home office, where the morning light would illuminate it each day, a reminder of what truly mattered, of what he was fighting to protect and nurture. The preliminary hearing for Victoria's case was scheduled for the following month. Jennifer Walsh was confident about the outcome. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and the charges were serious enough that a judge would almost certainly bind the case over for trial. Victoria's social standing, which she had worked so hard to build and maintain, was obliterated. The women who had once competed for invitations to her parties now avoided her completely. The charities she had supported quietly removed her name from donor lists. The life she had constructed as Mrs. Richard Montgomery was gone, replaced by the reality of her own choices and their consequences. David Thornton faced his own reckoning. The federal prosecutors were pursuing charges that could result in 20 years in prison if convicted on all counts. His attorneys were trying to negotiate, but they had little to offer. David had been the architect of the conspiracy, the one who had recruited others and coordinated the attacks on both Richard's business and personal life. There would be no sympathy from a jury, no mitigating circumstances that would excuse his actions. As the legal machinery ground forward, as depositions were taken and evidence was catalogued and trial preparations began, Richard found himself reflecting on how close he had come to losing everything. Not the business, not the money, not the social standing, but Emma. If he had continued down the path he had been on, buried in work and blind to what was happening in his own home, the damage might have been irreparable. Emma might have internalized Victoria's cruelty, might have grown up believing she was unwanted, burdensome, responsible for her mother's absence. The thought of that alternative reality was almost unbearable. But they had been given a second chance. The confrontation in the garden, as painful as it had been, had shattered the illusions and forced everyone to face uncomfortable truths. And now, slowly, carefully, they were building something new. Not perfect, not without scars, but real and honest and rooted in genuine love, rather than performance or pretense. Emma was healing. Richard was learning to be the father she needed. And the people who had tried to destroy them were facing the consequences of their actions. It was not a happy ending yet, but it was a beginning. A foundation on which something better could be built. Chapter 6. 3 weeks had passed since the searches and detentions, and autumn had settled fully over Connecticut, painting the trees in shades of amber and crimson. Emma stood in the garden, her hands gripping the parallel bars that Dr. Chen had installed for home practice, taking careful steps that required enormous concentration and effort. Richard watched from a nearby bench, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to give her space to work independently. Each step Emma took was a small victory, a reclamation of agency over her own body. Dr. Chen had explained that much of Emma's physical limitations stemmed not just from the injury itself, but from the way she had been discouraged from pushing herself. Victoria had reinforced helplessness, had made Emma feel that her limitations were permanent and shameful, that trying to improve was futile. Breaking through those psychological barriers was proving as important as rebuilding muscle strength. Emma needed to believe that progress was possible, that she was capable, that her body could be trusted to support her. The child psychologist they had started seeing, Dr. Michael Torres, a gentleman in his 60s with decades of experience helping children process trauma, had been instrumental in this shift. Through play therapy and careful conversation, he had helped Emma understand that what Victoria had done was not Emma's fault. That cruelty said everything about the person inflicting it and nothing about the person receiving it. Emma was beginning to articulate feelings she had kept buried, fears and hurts that had been festering in silence. And with each conversation, each validation of her experience, she seemed to stand a little taller, to carry herself with fractionally more confidence. Inside the house, Martha was baking, filling the kitchen with the warm scent of cinnamon and apples. She had noticed that Emma responded well to sensory comforts, to familiar smells and tastes that represented safety and care. The housekeeper had become something like a grandmother to Emma, providing steady affection and practical support that complemented Richard's growing emotional presence. Together, they were creating an environment where Emma could begin to believe in stability, in a future not defined by fear or hurt. Richard's phone buzzed with a call from Jennifer Walsh. The attorney had news about the legal proceedings. Victoria's preliminary hearing had resulted in the judge binding all charges over for trial as expected. But Victoria's legal team had presented something during the hearing that Jennifer felt Richard should know about: a psychiatric evaluation commissioned by Victoria's attorneys, attempting to establish mitigating circumstances. The evaluation painted Victoria as someone with severe attachment issues stemming from her own childhood, someone who had been obsessed with the idea of replacing Catherine rather than accepting her own identity, someone whose actions, while wrong, were driven by mental illness rather than malicious intent. Jennifer was clear that this would not absolve Victoria of legal responsibility. The evidence of premeditation, of coordination with David Thornton, of systematic theft and deception was too strong. But it might influence sentencing, might generate some sympathy from jurors who were looking for a reason to show mercy. And it revealed something about Victoria's psychology that, while not excusing her behavior, provided some context for understanding it. Richard listened, processing this information. Part of him felt that understanding Victoria's motivations was irrelevant, that her actions spoke for themselves, regardless of what psychological dysfunction drove them. But another part of him, the part that was learning to process his own grief and mistakes, recognized that people were complicated, that cruelty often grew from pain and insecurity, that even someone as seemingly calculating as Victoria might be a deeply damaged person acting out unresolved trauma. That evening, after Emma was in bed, Richard sat in Catherine's old study, the room he had kept locked for 3 years. Martha had cleaned it after Victoria's belongings had been removed, had restored it to something resembling its original state. Richard looked at the photographs on the shelves, images of Catherine laughing, of the 3 of them together when Emma was a toddler, of happier times that felt both achingly close and impossibly distant. He had loved Catherine completely, had built his entire understanding of family and partnership around their relationship. When she had been taken from them in that senseless accident, a drunk driver running a red light and ending her life instantly, Richard had not known how to process the loss. He had shut down emotionally, had thrown himself into work, had tried to rebuild normalcy by finding a replacement mother for Emma, rather than doing the harder work of grieving and healing. Victoria had seemed perfect for the role, polished and capable, willing to step into a ready-made family. He had not looked deeper, had not questioned her motivations, had not noticed the warning signs because he had not wanted to see them, and Emma had paid the price for his blindness. His young daughter, already dealing with the trauma of losing her mother and the physical challenges from that same accident, had been subjected to Victoria's twisted attempts to become Catherine, to erase the past and claim the love that could not be transferred or manufactured. Richard felt the weight of his failure, the knowledge that his choices had allowed Emma to be hurt. No amount of legal justice against Victoria could undo that. He could only move forward, could only try to be better, to be present, to ensure that Emma never felt abandoned or unprotected again. Dr. Torres had suggested that Richard might benefit from his own therapy, from working through his grief and guilt with a professional who could help him develop healthier coping mechanisms. Richard had resisted at first, feeling that his priority needed to be Emma, that his own emotional processing was secondary. But Dr. Torres had gently pointed out that Richard's ability to support Emma was directly connected to his own mental health. That unprocessed grief had a way of seeping into relationships and limiting emotional availability. If Richard wanted to be the father Emma needed, he would need to face his own pain rather than continuing to bury it in work and avoidance. Richard had scheduled his first appointment with a grief counselor for next week. It felt vulnerable, admitting that he needed help, that he could not simply push through on determination alone. But Emma's courage in facing her own therapy had inspired him. If his 8-year-old daughter could be brave enough to confront her fears and work on her healing, surely he could do the same. The trial date for Victoria and David Thornton had been set for early December. Brian Foster had already pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for his testimony, accepting a 3-year sentence and permanent prohibition from working in any technology field, requiring security clearance. His cooperation had filled in crucial details about the conspiracy, including the timeline of when David had first approached him, how the payments had been structured to avoid detection, and what specific data had been stolen and passed along. Frank Henderson, the private investigator, had uncovered additional evidence that strengthened the prosecution's case. He had found that David Thornton had been planning this revenge scheme for years, had set up the shell companies and offshore accounts long before Victoria had entered the picture. Victoria had been a convenient addition to his plan, someone with access to Richard's personal life and home, but David would have found another way to strike if she had not been available. The depth of David's obsession with destroying Richard was chilling, suggesting a level of resentment that went beyond normal business rivalry into something pathological. At Montgomery Technologies, the security overhaul was complete. New protocols had been implemented, requiring multiple layers of authentication for sensitive data access. The company had hired a chief security officer whose sole focus was protecting against internal and external threats, and perhaps most importantly, the company culture had shifted to emphasize transparency and communication, encouraging employees to report suspicious activity without fear of retaliation. The breaches had been damaging, but the response had made the company stronger, more resilient. Several competitors and business analysts had reached out to Richard, impressed by how he had handled the crisis. Instead of trying to hide the problems or minimize them, he had confronted them directly, had cooperated fully with law enforcement, had been transparent with clients and investors about what had happened and how it was being addressed. The approach had built trust rather than undermining it, had demonstrated leadership and integrity in a way that no marketing campaign could have achieved. But Richard found that his perspective on business success had fundamentally changed. The metrics that had once driven him, the market share and revenue growth and industry recognition, felt less important now. He still cared about the company, still wanted Montgomery Technologies to thrive, but not at the expense of everything else. He had learned in the most painful way possible that professional achievement meant nothing if it came at the cost of personal relationships, if it left him disconnected from the people who mattered most. On a Saturday morning, Richard took Emma to a farmer's market in town, a simple outing that would have been unthinkable a month ago, when his weekends were consumed by work. They walked slowly through the stalls, Emma using her crutch but moving with increasing confidence, stopping to examine handmade crafts and sample local honey and watch a folk musician play guitar. Other families smiled at them, and Richard realized that for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly participating in life, rather than just moving through it. Emma found a booth selling painted stones, each one decorated with bright colors and inspirational words. She studied them carefully before selecting one that said, "Strong" in bold letters. Richard paid the vendor, a kind older woman who complimented Emma's careful selection, and Emma clutched the stone tightly as they continued walking. Later at home, she would place it on her nightstand, a small reminder of her own resilience and the strength she was building day by day. They stopped for lunch at a small cafe, sitting outside despite the autumn chill, wrapped in jackets and scarves. Emma ordered pancakes, her favorite, and ate with the appetite of a child who was finally feeling safe enough to enjoy food without anxiety. They talked about school, about the book Emma was reading, about the art project she was working on for class. Normal conversation, the kind Richard had taken for granted before Catherine's passing, and had been too absent to share during his years of grief-driven workaholism. On the way home, Emma asked a question that surprised Richard. She wanted to know what would happen to Victoria. Would she go to jail? For how long? Did that mean Emma would never have to see her again? Richard considered his response carefully. He explained that Victoria had done serious things that were against the law, and that, yes, she would probably have to go to jail for a while. But he emphasized that Emma was safe now, that Victoria would not be allowed to hurt her or scare her again, that there were legal protections in place to ensure that. He also gently noted that while Victoria had been very mean, she was also probably a sad and confused person who had never learned how to be kind. That did not excuse what she had done, but it meant that Emma did not have to carry hate in her heart. She could simply be glad that Victoria was gone from their lives and focus on moving forward. Emma thought about this for a long time, gazing out the car window at the passing landscape. Then she said something that demonstrated wisdom beyond her years. She said she felt sorry that Victoria was sad, but that did not mean Victoria should have been mean to her. Richard agreed completely, proud of his daughter's ability to hold both compassion and clear boundaries, to recognize someone's pain without accepting their harmful behavior. That night, as Richard tucked Emma into bed, she asked him to tell her stories about Catherine. This was new. For 3 years, Emma had rarely mentioned her mother, as if the memories were too painful to access. But now, perhaps feeling more secure in her relationship with Richard, perhaps having processed some of her trauma with Dr. Torres, she was ready to remember, to celebrate the woman who had loved her before everything had changed. Richard told stories he had not shared in years. How Catherine had sung silly songs while cooking dinner, making up ridiculous lyrics that made everyone laugh. How she had insisted on reading multiple bedtime stories every night, doing different voices for each character. How she had loved thunderstorms, would pull Emma onto the porch to watch the lightning and listen to the rain, teaching her to count the seconds between flash and thunder to gauge how far away the storm was. Small memories, ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. Emma listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions, wanting to know more details. Did Mommy like chocolate or vanilla? What was her favorite color? Did she sing in the car? Richard answered each question, feeling the memories flow more easily than they had in years. He realized that he had been protecting himself from the pain of remembering, but in doing so, he had also denied both himself and Emma the comfort of celebrating Catherine's life. Grief did not have to mean forgetting. It could coexist with joy, with gratitude for the time they had been given, even as they mourned the time that had been stolen. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Richard sat with her a while longer, watching the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing, the relaxed expression on her face that suggested dreams unburdened by fear or anxiety. This, he thought, was what success looked like. Not a corner office or a growing stock price or industry accolades. This quiet moment of a child sleeping safely, knowing she was loved and protected. Everything else was just details. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Richard received an unexpected letter. It came through Jennifer Walsh's office, forwarded from Victoria's attorney. Victoria wanted to apologize, the letter said. She wanted Richard and Emma to know that she recognized the harm she had caused, that she had been consumed by jealousy and inadequacy, that she had allowed her obsession with becoming Catherine to blind her to the reality that Emma was a real child who deserved love and care, not a symbol of what Victoria could never have. The letter did not ask for forgiveness or leniency. It simply acknowledged the truth and expressed remorse. Jennifer had included a note saying that this might be a genuine attempt at accountability, or it might be a strategic move, designed to generate sympathy before trial. She left the decision of how to respond, if at all, entirely to Richard. Richard read the letter several times, trying to gauge its sincerity. Ultimately, he decided that Victoria's motivations did not really matter. What mattered was that Emma was safe, that the legal system was holding Victoria accountable, and that their family was healing. He did not respond to the letter, but he did not throw it away either. He filed it with the other documents related to the case, a piece of evidence in a larger story about damage and recovery, about the consequences of unchecked obsession and the possibility of moving forward despite profound hurt. The trial would come, and with it a final accounting of everything that had happened. But Richard had already found what he needed most: the connection with his daughter, the daily presence in her life, the commitment to prioritize what truly mattered. Victoria would face justice in a courtroom, but Richard had already begun the harder and more important work of building a future defined not by loss and absence, but by love and presence. The legal outcome would bring closure, but the real transformation was happening in the small moments. The therapy sessions and garden walks and bedtime stories, the slow rebuilding of trust, and the gradual healing of wounds both seen and unseen. Chapter 7. The courthouse in downtown Hartford was an imposing structure of granite and glass, built in an era when public buildings were designed to convey the weight and authority of the law. Richard arrived early on the first day of the trial, accompanied by Jennifer Walsh and flanked by security that Frank Henderson had insisted was necessary. Media trucks lined the street, reporters positioned themselves on the steps, and curious onlookers gathered behind police barriers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the principals, in what had become one of the most closely watched white-collar cases in Connecticut history. Richard had left Emma at home with Martha and Dr. Chen, who had agreed to spend the day keeping the girl occupied with therapy exercises and art projects. There was no reason for Emma to be exposed to the circus atmosphere of the trial, no benefit to her witnessing the formal dismantling of Victoria's defense. The prosecutors had taken Emma's deposition weeks earlier, conducted gently by an attorney trained in interviewing child witnesses, and that testimony would be presented to the jury without requiring Emma to appear in person. Jennifer had fought hard for that accommodation, arguing successfully that subjecting an 8-year-old to cross-examination by defense attorneys would constitute further trauma with no corresponding legal necessity. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and formal. Judge Patricia Reynolds, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for theatrics, presided from the bench. The jury, 12 citizens selected through weeks of careful voir dire, sat attentively, aware of the significance of the case they would be judging. Victoria sat at the defense table with her attorney, Marcus Steele, surprisingly absent, apparently having decided that his connection to Victoria was a liability he could no longer afford. Victoria looked diminished somehow, her designer clothes replaced by a conservative suit that seemed chosen to convey humility and remorse. She did not look at Richard when he entered, keeping her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. At the adjacent table, David Thornton sat with his own legal team, a trio of expensive attorneys who had been mounting an aggressive defense based on the argument that David's actions, while ethically questionable, did not rise to the level of criminal conspiracy. They claimed that competitive intelligence gathering was standard business practice, that David had merely been aggressive in pursuing legitimate business objectives. The prosecution would need to prove that David's actions crossed the line from aggressive competition into illegal sabotage and theft. The opening statements began with the prosecution laying out their case in methodical detail. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres, presented the story chronologically, from David Thornton's expulsion from Montgomery Technologies a decade earlier, through his years of planning and resource gathering, to his recruitment of Brian Foster and coordination with Victoria, to the actual theft of trade secrets and the campaign to destroy Richard's reputation. She described a conspiracy that was breathtaking in its scope and coldly calculated in its execution, driven by David's inability to accept business failure and Victoria's toxic obsession with replacing a woman she had never known. Rebecca presented the evidence systematically, the chat logs showing coordination between Victoria and David, the financial records documenting payments to Brian Foster, the security footage from the cameras Victoria had hidden throughout the Montgomery home, the testimony from Brian Foster himself, who described in detail how David had approached him, had gradually recruited him into the conspiracy with escalating payments and promises of future employment at David's company. The thumb drives and documents seized during the searches, the expert testimony from cybersecurity specialists explaining exactly what data had been stolen and how valuable it was. The case was comprehensive, overwhelming in its thoroughness. Victoria's attorney, a seasoned defender named Robert Chen, presented a different narrative. He acknowledged that Victoria had behaved inappropriately, that her treatment of Emma had been wrong, but argued that she had been manipulated by David Thornton, that she had been used as a pawn in his revenge scheme. He pointed to the psychiatric evaluation, to Victoria's troubled childhood, to her documented history of attachment disorders. He painted her as a victim herself, someone who had been exploited by a calculating businessman who recognized her vulnerabilities and used them to gain access to Richard's personal life. It was a sympathetic portrait, but one that struggled against the weight of evidence showing Victoria's active participation and coordination. David's attorneys took a more aggressive approach, attacking the prosecution's case on technical grounds, questioning the chain of custody for evidence, suggesting that the chat logs could have been fabricated or taken out of context, arguing that David's business activities, while competitive, were not illegal. They portrayed him as a successful entrepreneur who had been unfairly maligned by a competitor who could not handle legitimate business pressure. It was a strategy that might have worked in a case with less evidence, but here it seemed desperate and implausible. The trial proceeded over 2 weeks, with witness after witness taking the stand. Martha testified about what she had witnessed in the Montgomery household, her voice steady as she described Victoria's cruelty and the fear Emma had lived with. James, the driver, corroborated key details about Victoria's suspicious meetings and activities. Employees from Montgomery Technologies described the chaos caused by the security breaches, the damage to client relationships, the compromised data that had required extensive remediation. Michael Torres, the security analyst who had first discovered the suspicious account activity, walked the jury through the digital forensics that had traced the data theft back to Brian Foster's computer. Expert witnesses explained the value of the stolen algorithms and client lists, quantifying the damage in terms that made clear this was not minor theft, but industrial espionage on a significant scale. Financial analysts traced the payments from David's shell companies to Brian's accounts, demonstrating a clear paper trail of conspiracy and compensation for illegal activities. Emma's deposition was played for the jury, her voice small but clear, as she described life with Victoria, the casual cruelties and systematic undermining, the fear of doing anything wrong, the sense that she was unwanted in her own home. Several jurors visibly reacted, one woman wiping away tears, others shaking their heads in dismay. The video of Richard finding Emma in the garden that night, taken by one of the guests at the gala and submitted as evidence, was particularly powerful. The image of Emma on the ground, crying and reaching for her crutch while Victoria walked away, needed no narration or explanation. The defense teams did their best to create reasonable doubt, to suggest alternative explanations, to humanize their clients and contextualize their actions. Victoria's attorney brought in the psychologist who had evaluated her, who testified about the severity of her attachment issues and her distorted perception of family relationships. David's team presented character witnesses who spoke about his business acumen and philanthropy, trying to paint him as someone incapable of the sustained malice required for the conspiracy the prosecution alleged. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. Rebecca Torres systematically dismantled each defense argument, pointing back to the evidence, to the documented coordination, to the clear premeditation and planning that showed conscious choice rather than manipulation or misunderstanding. She reminded the jury that mental illness might explain behavior but did not excuse it, especially when that behavior was calculated and sustained over months. She noted that David's business success and charitable giving were irrelevant to the question of whether he had committed the crimes charged, that many accomplished people were capable of profound wrongdoing when driven by resentment and greed. In her closing argument, Rebecca brought the focus back to Emma. She described a child who had already endured tremendous loss and trauma, who deserved to grow up in safety and peace, but who had instead been subjected to systematic cruelty by the very person who should have been protecting her. She described Richard's trust that had been betrayed, not just by Victoria but by David, who had exploited the vulnerability created by personal tragedy to advance his own vendetta. She asked the jury to hold both defendants accountable, to send a message that such calculated cruelty and systematic theft would not be tolerated, that there were consequences for using innocent people as pawns in games of revenge and obsession. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The wait was excruciating for Richard, who tried to maintain normalcy at home for Emma's sake, while internally wrestling with anxiety about the outcome. Jennifer assured him that the prosecution's case had been strong, that conviction on most if not all charges was likely, but trials were unpredictable, and juries sometimes surprised everyone. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. Richard returned to the courthouse, his heart pounding as he took his seat behind the prosecution table. Victoria and David were brought in, both looking worn and anxious, the weeks of trial having stripped away their remaining veneer of confidence. Judge Reynolds called the court to order, and the jury foreman, a retired teacher in his 60s, stood to deliver the verdict. Guilty, on all counts. Corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit theft of trade secrets, wire fraud, obstruction of justice. The foreman's voice was steady as he read through each charge, and with each repetition of the word guilty, Richard felt something release in his chest, Not triumph or joy, but a profound sense of closure, of justice being served, of accountability being enforced. Victoria's attorney immediately requested leniency in sentencing, citing his client's mental health issues and her cooperation in providing testimony against David. David's attorneys filed notice of appeal even before sentencing, a predictable move that would delay but likely not prevent the consequences of the verdict. Judge Reynolds scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks hence, allowing time for pre-sentence reports and victim impact statements. She remanded both defendants to custody pending sentencing, denying bail given the severity of the convictions and the flight risk posed by defendants with significant financial resources. Victoria was led away in handcuffs, finally looking at Richard as she passed, her expression unreadable. David maintained his composure, his face carefully blank, refusing to show any emotion that might be interpreted as admission or regret. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed for statements. Jennifer made a brief comment on Richard's behalf, expressing satisfaction with the verdict and emphasizing that justice had been served not just for Richard and Montgomery Technologies, but most importantly for Emma, who could now grow up knowing that the people who had hurt her had been held accountable. Richard declined to speak, wanting to get home to his daughter, to reassure her that everything was okay, that the difficult part was over. At home, Emma was in the garden with Dr. Chen, working on a new exercise that involved walking on slightly uneven ground, building balance and confidence. When she saw Richard arrive, she called out excitedly, showing him how far she had walked without stopping. He hugged her tightly, overwhelmed by the simple normalcy of the moment, the contrast between the courtroom drama and this peaceful scene of a child making progress in her recovery. That evening, Richard tried to explain what had happened in terms Emma could understand. The jury, a group of people whose job was to figure out what was true, had decided that Victoria and David had done wrong things and would have to face consequences. It meant that Emma was safe, that Victoria could not come back and hurt her, that the people who had tried to hurt their family had been stopped. Emma listened seriously, processing this information, and then asked if they could have pancakes for dinner. Richard laughed, relieved by her resilience, by her ability to absorb difficult information, and then return to the preoccupations of childhood. They made pancakes together, Martha supervising and offering guidance, and the kitchen filled with laughter and the smell of warm maple syrup. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later was more subdued than the trial. Judge Reynolds heard from both sides, considered the pre-sentence reports that detailed Victoria's psychological history and David's previous legal record, and listened to victim impact statements from Richard and several Montgomery Technologies employees whose careers had been affected by the security breaches. Richard's statement was measured and focused primarily on Emma. He described the damage that Victoria's cruelty had caused, the way it had undermined his daughter's sense of safety and self-worth, the months of therapy that would be required to help her heal. He did not ask for the maximum sentence, but he did emphasize that the harm caused extended beyond financial damage to include profound psychological trauma to a vulnerable child. Judge Reynolds delivered her sentences with the gravity befitting the crimes. Victoria received 8 years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy, with credit for time served and the possibility of parole after serving 2/3 of the sentence, if she demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. David received 15 years, a longer sentence reflecting his role as the architect and primary coordinator of the conspiracy. Both would also be required to pay substantial restitution to Montgomery Technologies for the stolen data and business damage, amounts that would likely bankrupt them both, even if they had resources hidden away. The judge's statements accompanying the sentences made clear her view of the defendant's actions. She described Victoria's treatment of Emma as particularly egregious, an abuse of trust and authority that had compounded the trauma of a child who had already suffered tremendous loss. She characterized David's conspiracy as coldly calculated, driven by ego and revenge rather than any legitimate business purpose, and noted that his actions had endangered not just one company, but the entire ecosystem of trust that allowed the technology sector to function. As the defendants were led away to begin serving their sentences, Richard felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that it was finally over, sadness that any of it had been necessary, gratitude for the legal system that, however imperfectly, had ultimately delivered justice, and most of all a determination to ensure that Emma never again had to fear anyone hurting her, that the rest of her childhood would be characterized by safety, love, and the opportunity to reach her full potential without the shadow of cruelty and conspiracy hanging over her. In the weeks following sentencing, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The media attention faded as other stories captured public interest. Montgomery Technologies announced strong quarterly earnings, reassuring investors that the company had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. Richard's executive team continued to manage daily operations efficiently, allowing him to maintain the reduced schedule that prioritized time with Emma. The garden behind the mansion, where everything had changed that night months ago, had become a symbol of recovery and hope. Emma's progress with physical therapy was steady, her confidence growing with each small improvement. She would never forget what had happened, but with support and care, those memories were being integrated into her story rather than defining it entirely. She was learning that she was more than her trauma, more than her physical limitations, that she was a person of courage and resilience who was loved unconditionally by the people who mattered most. Richard had also continued his own therapy, working through his grief over Catherine's loss and his guilt over the mistakes he had made in the years following. He was learning to forgive himself, to accept that he had done the best he could with the understanding he had at the time, and that what mattered now was how he moved forward. The relationship between father and daughter had deepened, built on a foundation of honesty and presence, rather than the performance and absence that had characterized his earlier attempts at parenting. Martha remained the steady anchor of the household, her wisdom and care providing stability as Richard and Emma navigated their healing journey. James continued his loyal service, now with an added vigilance and protectiveness toward Emma that reflected his own guilt about not speaking up sooner. Dr. Chen's therapy sessions became a regular part of Emma's routine, marking steady progress in her physical capabilities. Dr. Torres continued to work with Emma on processing her experiences, helping her build healthy coping mechanisms and a strong sense of self. Together, this community of care was giving Emma the foundation she needed, not just to survive, but to thrive. The legal victory over Victoria and David had been important, had provided closure and justice, but the real transformation was happening in the daily moments of connection, support, and love that were gradually replacing the fear and pain that had once defined Emma's existence. This was the work that truly mattered, the ongoing commitment to creating a life worth living, to building a future characterized not by the damage others had inflicted, but by the healing that was now possible. Chapter 8. 6 months had passed since the sentencing. Handspring had returned to Connecticut, bringing with it the promise of renewal and growth. In the garden behind the Montgomery mansion, Emma walked without her crutch for the first time, her steps tentative but determined, as Richard stood a few feet away, arms outstretched, ready to catch her if she faltered. Dr. Chen watched from the side, her professional assessment, noting the remarkable progress Emma had made, not just physically, but in her confidence and willingness to challenge herself. Emma took 5 steps before losing her balance and reaching for Richard's steadying hands. But those 5 steps represented months of hard work, of exercises repeated until they became habit, of pushing through discomfort and fear to reclaim capabilities that had seemed permanently lost. Dr. Chen clapped enthusiastically, and Martha, watching from the kitchen window, wiped away tears of joy. This moment had seemed impossible just 6 months ago, when Emma could barely walk with assistance, when her physical limitations had been compounded by emotional trauma that made every movement an exercise in fear and doubt. Richard lifted Emma into a gentle hug, telling her how proud he was, how amazed he was by her determination and courage. Emma laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in recent months, the spontaneous joy of a child who was learning to trust that her world was safe, that the adults around her were committed to her well-being, that she had a future full of possibilities rather than limitations. The progress was not just physical. Emma's sessions with Dr. Torres had helped her process the trauma of Victoria's treatment, had given her tools to manage anxiety and fear when they arose, had helped her understand that what had happened to her was not her fault and did not define who she was or who she could become. She was still working through it, still had moments of insecurity and worry, but those moments were becoming less frequent and less overwhelming. She was learning to be a child again, to focus on school and friends and hobbies rather than constantly monitoring for danger. School had become a place Emma looked forward to rather than dreaded. Mrs. Robertson had continued to be a supportive presence, and Emma's classmates, after the initial awkwardness of not knowing how to respond to the news coverage, had settled into treating her like any other student. She had made close friends, particularly a girl named Sophie who shared her love of art, and who invited Emma to her house for playdates that Richard made sure to facilitate. Watching Emma interact with other children, laughing and creating and simply being present in the moment, filled Richard with a gratitude so profound it sometimes brought him to tears. Montgomery Technologies had not just recovered from the crisis, but had grown stronger. The security overhaul and the transparent way Richard had handled the breach had earned the respect of clients and competitors alike. The company had been approached by several organizations wanting to partner on cybersecurity initiatives, recognizing that Montgomery Technologies had valuable lessons to share about vulnerability assessment and threat response. Richard had hired additional executives to share leadership responsibilities, ensuring that the company could thrive even when he was not personally overseeing every decision. This delegation had freed Richard to maintain the schedule he had established, working from home several days a week, attending Emma's school events, being present for therapy appointments, having dinner together as a family every evening. Martha had often remarked that the mansion felt more like a home now than it had in years, filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter, rather than the echoing silence of empty rooms and absent occupants. Richard's own therapy had been transformative in ways he had not anticipated. Working through his grief over Catherine's loss had allowed him to remember her with joy rather than pain, to celebrate the years they had shared rather than focusing only on what had been taken. He had come to understand that his workaholic behavior after her passing had been a form of running, of avoiding the emotional processing that grief required. By finally facing that pain, by allowing himself to fully feel the loss, he had paradoxically freed himself to move forward, to be emotionally available to Emma in ways he had not been capable of before. The relationship between father and daughter had deepened into something beautiful and authentic. They had developed their own rituals and traditions, Saturday morning breakfasts where they cooked together, Richard teaching Emma to crack eggs and flip pancakes, evening walks in the garden when weather permitted, talking about their days, sharing observations about the changing seasons, bedtime stories that had evolved from Richard reading to Emma into Emma sometimes reading to him, practicing the skills she was developing at school. These small moments of connection formed the foundation of trust and love that Emma needed to heal and grow. Frank Henderson, the investigator, had become an occasional visitor to the house, having formed an unexpected friendship with James and Martha. He had continued to monitor for any threats to the family, though none had materialized. Victoria and David were serving their sentences, cut off from the resources and contacts they had once used to cause harm. Marcus Steele had disappeared entirely, apparently having decided that his association with Victoria was too toxic to maintain. The conspiracy that had once seemed so threatening had been dismantled completely, its architects removed from society and its participants scattered. The legal restitution from Victoria and David had been deposited into a trust fund for Emma's future, money that Richard had no need of, but that symbolized accountability for the harm they had caused. Richard had directed his attorneys to ensure that none of the funds would benefit him personally, that everything recovered would be dedicated to Emma's education, her continuing therapy, and eventually whatever dreams she chose to pursue as she grew older. On a warm Saturday in May, Richard organized a small gathering in the garden, inviting the people who had been instrumental in their recovery. Dr. Chen came with her husband, a gentleman who worked as a music teacher. Dr. Torres arrived with his wife, an artist who immediately connected with Emma over shared interest in painting. Jennifer Walsh brought her teenage daughter, who impressed Emma by treating her like a normal kid, rather than someone fragile or damaged. Frank Henderson came with James and Martha, the three of them forming an unlikely but solid friendship. Mrs. Robertson, Emma's teacher, stopped by with her own grandchildren, who integrated Emma into their games with easy acceptance. It was not a celebration of victory over adversity, but rather a gathering of community, an acknowledgement that healing was not a solitary journey, but required the support and care of people committed to each other's well-being. Richard watched Emma play with the other children, her movements still careful but increasingly confident, her laughter genuine and unrestrained. This, he thought, was what success looked like. Not a business empire or professional recognition, but a child who was safe and happy and surrounded by people who cared for her. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to depart, Emma came to Richard with a painting she had been working on in secret with Dr. Torres. It showed the garden, rendered in bright watercolors, with two figures holding hands, one tall and one small. Behind them was a path that extended toward a horizon filled with light. At the bottom, in Emma's careful printing, were the words, "We keep going together." Richard held the painting carefully, overwhelmed by the simple profundity of the message. They had been through darkness, had faced betrayal and cruelty, and the revelation of wounds both old and new. But they had survived. More than survived, they had begun to truly live, to build a life characterized not by what they had lost, but by what they were creating together. The path ahead would have its challenges, its moments of difficulty and doubt. Emma would always carry the physical reminders of her injury, and both of them would carry the emotional scars of what they had endured. But they would face those challenges together, supported by a community of care, guided by hard-earned wisdom about what truly mattered. That evening, after all the guests had left and the garden had been cleaned, Richard and Emma sat together on the porch, watching fireflies emerge in the dusk. Emma leaned against her father, drowsy and content, and asked if they could do this again, have another gathering with all the people who had helped them. Richard promised they would, that this was just the beginning of building the kind of life they both deserved, filled with connection and joy, and the steady presence of people who cared. As Emma drifted toward sleep, Richard thought about how far they had come from that terrible night when he had found her crying in the garden, abandoned and hurt. The journey had been painful, had required confronting truths he had been avoiding for years, had demanded a fundamental reassessment of his priorities and values. But it had also been necessary, had opened possibilities that had seemed lost forever. He had rediscovered his daughter, had learned to be the father she needed, had built a life that honored Catherine's memory not by trying to replace her, but by cherishing what she had given them and using it as a foundation for moving forward. The legal battles were over, the conspirators punished, the immediate threats neutralized. But the real work, the work of healing and growing and building a future worth living, that work continued every day in small moments and patient efforts. Richard was committed to that work, had learned that it was the most important investment he could make, more valuable than any business deal or professional achievement. Emma was his priority, his purpose, his reason for making every choice with care and intention. As the stars emerged overhead and the night settled around them, Richard carried his sleeping daughter inside, tucked her into bed with her painted stone on the nightstand and her new painting already hung on the wall, where morning light would illuminate it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her peaceful sleep, and whispered a promise into the quiet room. He would protect her, support her, love her unconditionally. She would never again have to face cruelty or neglect or the failure of adults to meet their responsibilities. He had learned his lesson in the hardest possible way, and he would not forget it. The path forward stretched before them, uncertain in its specifics, but clear in its direction. They would walk it together, father and daughter, supported by the community they had built, guided by love and presence, and the hard-earned understanding that what mattered most could not be measured in conventional metrics of success. The garden, where everything had changed, would remain a symbol of both their darkest moment and their greatest transformation, a reminder that from pain and crisis could come healing and renewal if met with courage and commitment. Richard turned off the light and closed Emma's door softly, leaving it slightly ajar so she would know he was nearby if she needed him. He walked downstairs to where Martha was finishing the last of the cleanup. thanked her for everything she did and had done, for being the steady presence that had held them together when everything else was falling apart. She smiled, patting his hand in that grandmotherly way she had, and told him that love and dedication could overcome any obstacle, that what he and Emma had built together was beautiful and strong, and would last because it was rooted in truth and genuine care. As Richard finally settled into bed that night, exhausted but content, he reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from tragedy, the forced confrontation with his own failures as a father, the discovery that professional success meant nothing without personal connection, the realization that healing required vulnerability and presence rather than control and avoidance, the understanding that community and support were not weaknesses but essential sources of strength. These lessons had come at a terrible price, but they had fundamentally transformed him, had made possible the life he and Emma were now living, a life characterized by authenticity and love rather than performance and absence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments to practice the principles he had learned. Emma would continue her therapy, making incremental progress that would compound over time into significant gains. Richard would continue to show up, to be present, to prioritize what truly mattered. Martha would continue her steady care, and Dr. Chen would continue guiding Emma's physical recovery, and Dr. Torres would continue supporting her emotional healing. Together they would keep moving forward, keep building, keep choosing love and presence over fear and avoidance. The story that had begun with tears in a garden on a terrible night had transformed into something beautiful and hopeful. Not perfect, not without scars, but real and honest and filled with the kind of love that could withstand any storm. Richard closed his eyes, finally at peace, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, he and Emma would face it together, supported by their community, guided by their hard-earned wisdom, and sustained by the simple but profound commitment to being there for each other, every day without fail, without excuse, without the distractions that had once pulled them apart. This was what redemption looked like. This was what healing meant. This was home,